All right. Hello, everyone. My name is David Moore. My partner Chris and I decided to study amyotrophic lateral sclerosis disease this semester, otherwise known as ALS disease. Now, I want to start off with a quick interesting fact slash side note because I'm sure many of you have probably heard about ALS disease over the past several years, but may not be as familiar with what ALS actually is. So, just a quick side note, think about summer of 2014 for just a couple minutes. I'm sure you guys have probably saw all the videos going around social media about the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. Now, seemingly silly to probably many of you, including myself at the time. Ooh, pour water with ice about over your heads. It was fun. But the main purpose of the actual challenge was to bring awareness to ALS disease and how degenerative and serious the disease actually is. Um, so to kind of put it into perspective about how serious it actually is and the research that needs to go into this disease still, that summer alone, the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge raised over $115 million to put towards the not only the research but to help families affected by this disease. So I don't want to spoil everything, so let's get right into the PowerPoint. So symptoms. So ALS is a very rare disease, and it's not seen by doctors in their everyday association and contact with patients. Symptoms are generally pretty subtle and quite often overlooked by doctors. And as they become more and more overlooked, they also become gradually more and more severe. And the same goes with the progression of the disease, with the disease. If it's not noticed, it's just going to get worse. So with neurodegenerative diseases, you often see eventually issues with muscles and atrophy in the muscles. So a lot of that's going to be associated with frequent muscle cramps and twitches in the legs and limbs and fasciculations. Later on in the PowerPoint, we're also going to talk about hypoglossal nerves. Um, just briefly, so the nerve itself controls a lot of the facial functions of our day-to-day lives. So speech, chewing, swallowing, three of those things are pretty important for our everyday lives. So in terms of where the disease may start, the disease may start in either the hand or even the leg. If it starts in the hand, a lot of people are going to associate it with difficulty in performing specific tasks. So it could be anywhere from picking up a phone or a pencil and writing your name down on a piece of paper, um, or even typing away at a keyboard. If it starts in the leg, a lot of people are going to have issues and difficulty walking and taking basic steps. Uh, as the disease progresses more and more, people are going to develop a difficulty with making basic decisions. I don't want to confuse you though, because that may be a little misleading. Um, it's not quite as similar to Alzheimer's as some people think. People with ALS disease are generally quite aware of their disease progression and of what's going on. With that said, a lot of people are going to probably become depressed and anxious with everything going on. And doctors need to take that into high consideration when they develop a course of action for this patient in the coming days, months, even years, probably. And in doing so and trying to come up with that course of action, the doctors need to come up with some sort of diagnosis. And it's very hard, specifically with ALS, because there isn't one specific test to say, hey, you have ALS disease. The diagnostic testing for ALS disease involves a lot of using other tests to rule out all sorts of other issues and diseases and issues and then just illnesses with the body. And some of those just may include basic physical exams, blood and urine testing, MRIs, electrophysiological testing, et cetera, et cetera. Just to get in the details of a couple of these, the blood and urine testing, for example, this is going to generally rule out thyroid diseases, HIV, hepatitis, and cancer, four of which you don't want to overlook at all. Obviously, I'm sure you all heard of all four of those, and those are pretty serious things aside from ALS. The MRI, this is going to rule out herniated discs in the back. As you saw on the previous slide, one of the symptoms of ALS is difficulty walking, possible difficulty walking, and that could be associated with herniated discs. So, I mean, obviously, you don't want to come down with a diagnosis of ALS if all it really is a herniated disc. Electrophysiological testing. What this test does is identifies damages to muscles and nerves unrelated to ALS. What we're going to find later on in the PowerPoint is how nerve cells communicate with each other, and any sort of lapse in those in the communication from nerve cell to nerve cell may cause damage to the nerves that are just unrelated to the ALS disease. Electromyography. This is going to help identify abnormal patterns of nerve activity. This kind of lines up with the electrophysiological testing, basically looking at how one nerve cell communicates with another nerve cell, and so on and so forth. And finally, proof of progression. Is the disease getting worse? If all those other tests come back negative for the respective test, and the body is just getting worse and it's not getting better at all, ALS is going to be quite strongly considered, and a plan of action is going to have to be developed by a specialized team of doctors. So I just want to get into the normal physiology real quick, obviously, of the disease. So normal physiology of the brain involves a lot of normal voluntary and even involuntary control of the body's movements. So the normal movements are controlled through the use of the motor association cortex, which controls the primary motor cortex, which you can see up here in the picture. So the neurons in the primary motor cortex control, different functions and movements of the body. So you're going to see up here in the cerebral cortex and the frontal lobe of the brain. So the neurons in the superior region up here control movements in the feet, trunk, and hands. And if you look down here, neurons in the inferior region are going to control functions of the fingers, the face, the lips, and all those other types of things. Um, just a fun fact about the nerve cells, because motor neurons are, generally speaking, pretty unique cells. Obviously, without them, the body would not be able to move in the ways that we know it can. But motor neurons are quite unique because they're the longest in the body. Obviously, you have the axon and the dendrites and the soma and the axon terminal. And eventually, these cells are going to line up and bind with each other to create a long chain and eventually a gigantic network of millions and millions of neuron cells. And that's pretty unique to the nervous system, and it's quite interesting to how it associates with the normal physiology. So as I just said, there are millions of neurons that are interconnected throughout the brain. So in order to cause a movement in either your limbs or your head or anywhere in the body, what's going to happen is that these neurons are going to have to send electrical impulses to one another. And we refer to these as action potentials. So impulses are carried down motor fibers from the spinal cord. And the action potentials are ultimately sent through the brain via interconnected neurons down the spinal cord via gray matter. Now, gray matter is made up of primarily neural cell bodies and short unmyelinated axons. But I see there's a note here about the cortical bulbar tract too. So we're going to talk about that on the next slide. But the cortical spinal tract and the bulbar tracts, those two, although they sound pretty similar, what the two of them are going to do is they're actually going to control muscle movements in order to achieve desired movements of the body. Let's move on to the next slide. So we just talked about the normal physiology. Now we're going to talk about the pathophysiology. So what's going on, what's wrong with the body once you're affected with ALS. So obviously, because this is a neurodegenerative disease, eventually you're going to have no motor neurons because of the degeneration of the nerve cells. And obviously, if you don't have any motor neurons, you're not going to have any electrical impulses that are going to be generated. And with no electrical impulses, you're not going to have any voluntary movements. And without any voluntary movement, you're not going to be able to move your limbs, and your skeletal muscle inside your limbs are going to atrophy. And that's not good. Another thing that's going to happen with the pathophysiology is the sclerosis of the cortical spinal and the cortical bulbar tracts. I know we just talked about the cortical spinal and the bulbar tracts, but so before we talk about those a little bit more, the sclerosis is an abnormal hardening of body tissue. So when the sclerosis happens to the cortical spinal and bulbar tracts, what basically happening is it's degenerating and hardening the body tissues inside those two tracts. So, like I said before on the slide, they sound quite similar because obviously both start with cortical, but they're a little bit different. So the cortical spinal tract is a white matter motor pathway controlling movement of the limbs and the trunk. So obviously, if you have the sclerosis and the degeneration right there in that motor pathway, it's going to block the nerve cells from communicating with each other, and you're not going to be able to have any free movement with your limbs and your trunk. Similar goes with the cortical bulbar tract. So the cortical bulbar tract is actually a neuron path that ultimately unites the cerebral cortex with the cranial nerve nuclei and the brainstem, which is involved again with motor function. So if you have the sclerosis or even the degeneration of the motor neurons in between the cerebral cortex and the cranial nerve nuclei, the same thing's going to happen. You're not going to have any motor function. It's not going to be good for the body. Another thing that happens with people affected by ALS disease is the thinning of the hypoglossal nerves. I know I talked about that on the first or second slide. So the hypoglossal nerves are what control the tongue and all the facial movements. So obviously it's clear why we need them, because we need to talk, we need to eat and swallow. And without it, some people are going to have troubles in that aspect. And obviously we need those to sustain life. One of the aspects of the pathophysiology of those with ALS, which I found to be the most interesting. So this is a progressive degeneration of motor neurons, and it's ultimately going to lead to what we refer to as apoptosis, which is basically called cell death. So in our body, we have something called intracellular calcium. And if the intracellular calcium is too high, it may be indicative of excessive stimulation of glutamate. Now, glutamate is by far the most abundant excitatory neurotransmitter in the nervous system. And ultimately, what's going to happen is if we have too much glutamate in our system, it can lead to overexciting a neuron, leading to cell death or apoptosis, like I just defined. We define this as excitotoxicity, which is pretty common in those ALS. Obviously, we don't want the overexciting of a neuron because the more overexcitation we have of the neurons, the more cell death we're gonna have. And it's basically going to be millions and millions of motor neurons pretty much committing suicide. And we don't want that because obviously we need motor neurons to survive. So the risk factors, it's pretty similar to that of the symptoms. I mean, these are going to vary from person to person. Um, Obviously, one person may be more susceptible than the next person. But risk factors are found to range anywhere from genetic factors to even dietary factors. So in terms of the genetic factors, the two major genetic contributors to ALS known to date are the C90RF72 gene and the S0D1 gene, both of which are protein coding genes. Now, I'm not sure how much you guys know about protein coding genes, but protein coding genes are very important for the body. Without protein coding genes, you would not be you. I would not be myself. They make up your very genetic code. So if there's an alteration in one of those genes and the way it codes the protein, um, it's going to affect other things with potentially nerve cells, and it's going to be it's going to increase your risk factor for ALS disease. Physical factors. If you are noting higher levels of physical fitness and a slightly lower BMI or body mass index than the average person, it's going to be the average increase the risk of someone being found to have ALS disease. Occupational. This kind of goes hand in hand with any really sort of occupation. If you're exposed to chemicals, pesticides, metals, um, electromagnetic fields, as with any occupation, you're going to be exposed to a greater susceptibility for any disease. But specifically in terms of ALS, being exposed to any of those can put you at an increased risk of being put at risk for ALS. And finally, dietary. A study found that the regular use of vitamin E supplements were actually associated with a lower risk of being put at risk of ALS. And we thought that was just a pretty interesting fact to include in there. And so I wanted to include here these two pictures here. I know obviously we can talk about the degeneration and you can probably take my word for it, but I wanted to include these two pictures just to put into perspective about how debilitating and how degenerative this disease really is. So if you take a look at the image here on the left, you see this is a picture of a normal, healthy brain. You see the brain tissue is fully intact. All the spaces are relatively full in the cranium. And if you move over to the photo over here on the right, you see it's not even close. You see a lot of empty space here, what used to be brain matter, and this is just, it's due to the degeneration of all the motor neurons in the brain tissue. I mean, even here, if you look down the middle, the two hemispheres are not even connected, as you would see right here on the left photo. Like I said, I know you could take my word for it, but I thought that this was a pretty cool representation in comparison with the photo on the left, just how severe and serious ALS disease really is. And lastly, we have therapeutic intervention. Unfortunately, scientists and medical professionals haven't developed a cure for ALS yet. I say yet very cautiously. Um, However, modern techniques can slow the spread or even decline the loss of function caused by ALS disease. Um, One of the most common therapeutic interventions medical professionals use is a treatment by use of medication. And one of the common medications that doctors are going to use is something called riluzole. So riluzole is a direct antagonist of sodium channels that are associated with damaged neurons and NMDA receptors. Um, so what's going to happen with the riluzole is going to work by preventing the release of glutamate from presynaptic terminals, which transports messages between nerve cells and motor neurons. So the riluzole also works to increase the rate that glutamate clears away from the synapse, which we may refer to sometimes as reuptake, and ultimately, therefore, decreasing the rate at which nerve cells send signals to each other and eliminating the increased excitation of the nerve cell. I know we talked a couple slides ago about exotoxicity. So obviously, if we have the riluzole working to increase the rate that glutamate goes away, we're not going to have that over excitation of the nerve cells. And obviously, we're not going to have the cell death, the apoptosis, and we're not going to have millions and millions of cells committing suicide, which is great. We want that. We don't want that. We want that to not happen. Um, so, as with any medication, um, some of the side effects are going to include headaches and sweating and facial pain and tightness. Now, we may see these side effects as side effects and through our lens, but if you jump into the shoes of a person who is affected by ALS disease, they're not going to see those side effects as side effects. They're going to see the riluzole or even the side effects as an opportunity to prolong their life. As I said, this isn't a solution, the medicine by any means, but if you can prolong a patient's life, even just slightly, give them more time to hug their family members and see their grandchildren and their children grow up, it'll make a whole difference in the world. So that about sums it up. I hope you guys learned something, enjoy the presentation, and I hope you guys are still staying safe. Have a good one, guys.